Hello everybody, you may realise it's April Fool's Day today, and in that spirit I've decided to do some rather hilarious performance art of sorts, where I ironically do something that runs directly contrary to my entire YouTube brand. I'm sure you can already tell what it is. I'm going to be reading from a script. But I assure you, this is the one aspect of this video being done ironically, and indeed I will, after this video, return back to my unscripted ramblings. Honestly, no longer scripting my videos has made it easier for me to dramatically increase my output on YouTube, and I've actually responded to over 50 videos on this channel so far. Now some people might say that's a bit obsessive. Anyway, I've been accused in the past of not listening to trans people, and assured that if I did just listen, I'd change my views on gender identity. These people often are aware that I've responded to so many pro-trans ID videos, but they claim that I haven't listened properly. I'd just go into these videos with the wrong attitude, and I'd always dismiss this as cult-like rhetoric arguing that people who disagree are only disagreeing because of a personal flaw cutting off their access to real truth. However, the other day, as I was listening back through every video I've ever made in chronological order, as I do every day, I realized that I had been listening wrong this whole time. Suddenly, I realized that all these people I'd been responding to had really great arguments that I just hadn't noticed. But this time I did. I heard all those great arguments, and my eyes were opened. Now, unfortunately, I can't go back through and tell you every great argument. You'll just have to watch every single one of my videos yourself on repeat until you have the epiphany I had. But what I can do is help you out a bit by presenting in this video the best arguments from every video I've responded to from September 2020 until now. You may be wondering why only from September 2020, and there's actually a really good reason for only going back that far. I couldn't be bothered to go back further. Anyway, without further ado, I present the best argument from every TRA video I've responded to. There's a lot to get through, so let's get things moving. So we start off with this interview with Judith Butler from The New Statesman. I know this isn't a video, but Judith Butler is such an intelligent and informed academic on this issue that I felt I needed to reference her knowledge of the gender critical movement, especially when she pointed out that gender critical people not only object to trans identity, but also to gender nonconformity by pathologizing it. Now I know what you're thinking. Aren't there loads of butch lesbians in the gender critical movement? Surely they would be gender nonconforming. But you have to remember that they're all lesbians, which means they're probably actually men deep down, and therefore they're not really being gender nonconforming at all. Next up we have YouTuber Jammy Dodger talking about the label cisgender. And as Jammy Dodger points out, there's no reason to object to the word cis since it just means not trans. It's just a way of clarifying that biological females are a subset of women, and I don't see how anybody could object to the implications of that. Contra's J.K. Rowling video shook up the game by making a really fantastic point. Contra pointed out that this question of whether trans women are women doesn't really matter. It's a stupid, irrelevant question, and Contra made the brilliant, sobering point that what we really need to focus on is the real-world hardships that trans women face. Things like not being allowed into women's spaces, or not being called by female pronouns. Clearly the question of whether trans women are women was distracting from these much more important questions. In Philosophy Tube's identity video, we saw Abigail Thorne explain how people at birth are identified as boys or girls. As Thorne brilliantly put it, when I was born, they said, "It's a boy." Truly, that's exactly how it works. I remember when I was just arbitrarily declared to be a boy too. They also said something about being 8 pounds or something. I've often wondered if they might have been trying to describe some kind of material reality with those words. Now, it's true that just now, when I looked up typical weights for newborn babies, it did draw a distinction between two types of baby, male and female. Sometimes I think that we have so many words, it would almost be useful to start using those words to describe things. You know, things we observe. But until then, we're just going to have to accept the fact that we were all arbitrarily declared to be boys or girls when we were babies. In Destiny's video reacting to J.K. Rowling, he makes a really good point about how pathetic it is when people get upset just because somebody else doesn't share their opinion on how a particular word should be defined. He says that if you get really upset about people defining a word differently from you, then it suggests that you're just not confident that your own definition makes much sense. Good point, Destiny. Very good defense of the trans identity movement. In Samantha Lux's video on being non-binary, she chides Ariella Scarcella for rejecting non-binary identities simply because every non-binary person she'd spoken to hadn't been able to give a coherent definition of what it means to be non-binary. Lux explains that just because Scarcella hasn't found a conception of non-binary identity that makes sense by speaking to non-binary people, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and advises Scarcella to actually speak to some non-binary people to understand the topic better. I just can't believe she hadn't tried that before, honestly. In Lindsay Ellis's video on pop culture transphobia, she epically destroys J.K. Rowling, and I must admit that I can't believe I hadn't noticed this before. J.K. Rowling cares about children? And don't you know that thinking of the children is something that only right-wing conservatives do? Thanks to this epic takedown by Lindsay Ellis, I have exposed so many people concerned about child poverty as reactionaries by posting "think of the children" memes at them. Very epic. Thanks, Lindsay. Tom Nicholas takes on the cancel culture myth in one of his videos, where he shows that people only complain about cancel culture because they want to take the focus away from the actual ideas themselves and only talk instead about the fact that ideas are being censored at all. This is very true. I thought that all the gender-critical people wanting to express their ideas in free and open debates and complaining about being unable to do that was because they wanted to express their ideas, but clearly this whole time it was just 5D chess because they didn't want to discuss ideas at all and were just bluffing by complaining about cancel culture. In Philosophy Tube's coming out public statement, Thorne makes the incredibly powerful point that trans people can't use their passport as proof of identity when getting married, and instead have to use a different proof of identity. Truly, no greater oppression has ever been known. Imagine being deprived of your passport, the go-to form of ID for people who are so resolute about not driving that they haven't even bothered applying for a provisional driving license, or the people who recently lost their wallet on a night out and are having to use their passports until they can get their driver's license replaced. But to tell you the truth, I can relate to this, because I also can't use my passport as a form of ID, mostly because I'm incapable of finding my passport at any point except for within 5 minutes of needing to leave for an international flight. In Jammy Dodger's Super Straights video, Jammy makes the salient point, "I could call an orange a slipper," doesn't make it true, does it? I, for one, am going to call this argument self-aware. And it was a Jammy Dodger double bill, because in Jammy's next video on being peak trans, Jammy was confronted with an image that said, "biological reality," and muttered the immortal words, "I don't understand."
Biological reality? I don't understand.
Yes, we know you don't understand. The thing is, I'm always told by TRAs that if I don't understand something, that probably means it's true. So assuming they're consistent with this logic, that must mean that TRAs think biological reality is true. And who could forget Lily Simpson, who in a TERFs 101 style video explained that believing biological reality is the referent for whether somebody should be considered a woman is equivalent to supporting 1950s gender roles. The regressive sexism of gender-critical feminists needs to be exposed. Don't they realize that the biological reality of the female sex existing is inextricably tied to the traditional housewife role of the 1950s? What kind of sexist wouldn't immediately make that association? Then, of course, Sam Sader weighed in on women's sports and pointed out that it's basically exactly like the segregation of sports along racial lines. Now, I'm a bit younger than Sam, and I'm a bit more removed from when racial segregation in sports was still a thing. So I'm just going to have to take Sam's word for it when he says that racial segregation in sports was controversial because white people weren't allowed to identify as black people. I mean, that must have been it, right? Because otherwise the only similarity between these two things would just be the incredibly superficial similarity that it's some kind of segregation in sports. Although maybe Sam's right and any kind of segregation in sports is bad, in which case I can't wait to see the Arsenal men's team play the Tottenham under-5s in a derby that will determine once and for all who are the true kings of North London. Big Joel totally destroyed Dave Rubin in a response on Orwell and identity. Dave Rubin said that the insistence that people use language that contradicts their own understanding of reality is kind of Orwellian. And Joel, savvy media critic that he is, read between the lines and restated Rubin's position as, "trans people are trying to brainwash us." This intellectually honest decision to steelman Rubin's position with this particular phrasing is made even more brave by the fact that Dave Rubin is an intellectual powerhouse in his own right. Remember when Thought Slime showed how gender-critical people aren't really materialists? You probably didn't pay attention because it was such a good point that if you were paying attention you'd have long since abandoned my channel. Mr. Slime made this indisputable point: you aren't going to find the words he or she in a laboratory, and as we know, what makes something materialism is when the literal words in contention can be found in a lab. Returning back to women's sports, Samantha Bee argued that conservatives have become so desperate around the gender identity issue that they've even started defending women's rights. And that, of course, is when you know an ideology has become desperate. when they start forming effective coalitions across political lines. Clearly, if the TRAs have been so effective that they've made the Conservatives resort to the desperate tactic of winning support amongst a key base of support for the Democrats, they must be doing something right. In Lily Alexandre's explanation of how gender ideology doesn't exist, Lily at one point asks this of trans people who discuss the validity of trans identity. What did you expect? In context, what Lily was saying is that, of course, if people thought about the trans identity debate, they're going to end up coming to the wrong conclusions. And I thought, that is a good point. I thought about the trans identity debate, so that must mean that I've come to the wrong conclusions too. Thank you, Lily, for helping me work that out. Next up, we have Walsh's video on the sex spectrum. Now, Walsh actually makes two really good points in this video. First of all, showing that sex is a spectrum by taking a variety of different expressions of biological sex and putting them on a spectrum. I mean, that's pretty irrefutable. What else could all these differences of sexual development be? Variation within two binary categories? No! Clearly we're all just varying degrees of male or female. Buy my alpha pills to go up 10 ranks in the male league. Also, Walsh points out that even the animal kingdom validates trans identity by pointing to an example of a lioness who started developing male sexual characteristics when adopting a more male role within the pride. This is a very accurate analogy to trans identity in humans. I hadn't done the dishes in months due to my transphobic fear that my penis would fall off if I started acting too much like a woman. Now I know there's nothing to fear. It would just make me valid like a lion. Okay, so this also isn't a video, but Laurie Penny was influential in helping me realize I'd picked the wrong side when she pointed to the completely unreasonable and over-the-top backlash she'd received simply for saying that maybe the obligation lies with children not to look at people exposing their genitals. Turns out, thinking of the children is fine sometimes, as long as you're just thinking about how they're the ones responsible for preventing sexually harassing acts being committed against them. Now, with Philosophy Tube's social construct video, Abigail admitted to not really wanting to talk about gender identity directly, and this was the right decision because it allowed the philosophy to really shine through. Philosophy such as claiming metaphysics deals with how cars work, and claiming that philosophy is really interesting but can't be spoken about because those damn gender-critical people might disagree. And you can tell the philosophy is really interesting because as preparation for this video, Philosophy Tube looked at one whole book on social constructs. Philosophy Tube's passion and hard work really inspired me and made me realize maybe I should spend as much time thinking critically about gender identity as Philosophy Tube clearly spends thinking about philosophy. And now here I am, saying that I've changed my mind. I also reviewed Julie Ray Goldstein's argument, claiming there is literally no way to define a biological female in a way that includes all biological females, while excluding all non-biological females. I'd always assumed that coherent definitions were really important, but apparently Goldstein is able to make an argument that refers repeatedly to biological females at several points, while simultaneously arguing that biological female can't be understood as a concept. So I guess it turns out that you don't need to be able to define or understand words in order to make reference to them. The YouTube channel Powered by Rainbows made a video explaining trans science, which also included an explanation of how male brains and female brains are definitely real and that somebody is trans when they have the wrong brain for their body. I find this super convincing and am very excited for all the other trans people to tell me how correct and non-problematic my understanding of trans identity must be. I mean, you can tell by how many times I've mentioned male brains and female brains in this video so far that this understanding of trans identity is incredibly popular with the modern trans community. Jessie Gender made a video explaining gender-critical beliefs and how these harm trans people. It featured a quote from Janice Raymond, an early gender-critical feminist theorist, claiming that the solution to transsexualism, as Raymond calls it, would best be served by mandating it out of existence. Now at the time, I called Jessie Gender up on the fact that by editing this quote to remove the qualifier morally from the word mandating, Janice Raymond had been misrepresented. Raymond wasn't saying that we needed laws to mandate being trans out of existence, but rather that our attitude towards morality should change, to cause a general cultural shift to create a society where a regressive idea like biological males imposing themselves on women by identifying as women simply wouldn't fly. Now, it is true that Jessie unambiguously doctored a Janice Raymond quote to make it look worse, but then it hit me. What's worse, doctoring a quote to prove a point, or being such a massive nerd that you're able to, in a completely blind reaction, immediately identify that a quote has been doctored? Imagine being so obsessed with this debate that you can immediately clock when one word has been removed from a Janice Raymond quote. Doesn't that sound like the description of an obsessed loser? I think we all know who came out of this response video looking worse. Speaking of quotes, in Sean's video on Terry Pratchett's views about gender identity, he references the fact that Pratchett's daughter said he would be pro-trans identity, and claimed that this should literally end the discussion about his views. And I was way too dismissive of this claim. For some reason, I said that children don't know their parents so well as to be totally authoritative on their parents' beliefs, and that it's possible that there are things that Pratchett's daughter wouldn't know. I now realise, though, that this just spoke to my own poor relationship with my parents, and have, after a great deal of therapy, unlocked the secret telepathic connection all family members have with each other that I'd previously been unaware I was missing out on. Now, this was something pointed out to me in the first ever response video to me by Veritas et Caritas. Actually, there was a response video made to me by a right-winger way back in 2015, but that doesn't count because obviously that was responding to my progressive politics, and as we all know, gender-critical people only pretend to have progressive views in order to pretend they aren't conservative bigots. Anyway, in Veritas's video, he takes issue with me saying that the contemporary trans debate only became mainstream with J.K. Rowling voicing her opinion on it. Now, Veritas calls out my ignorance on this and says that I'm only making this claim because that's when I personally got involved in this discussion. Now sure, you could scroll back and see that I've been talking about gender identity way before J.K. Rowling started expressing gender-critical views, but as we've just established, anything gender-critical people do that contradicts TRA arguments must just be a facade designed to make TRAs look wrong. Now eventually Judith Butler got interviewed again, but I first realised how dangerous the gender-critical movement was here when they tried to censor Judith Butler. The claim that radical feminists are actually in league with the far right is such a non-unhinged take, an entirely hinged take, that it's not surprising that all the gender-critical people were desperately fighting to have this censored, because it would definitely make Judith Butler look very reasonable if she accused peak lib J.K. Rowling of actually being fascist. This is why gender-critical people to this day never bring up this claim made by Judith Butler. To complete our Jammy Dodger trifecta, I again responded to Jammy on the subject of gender identity, and here Jammy made a really good point. Words being inclusive is good, and the more inclusive words are, the better. In fact, I've decided to make all the words in this sentence so inclusive that whatever I'm saying now can be completely up to you. These words I'm saying right now can mean anything you want them to mean, because I like to have the best words. And the best words are the most inclusive words. And if you have a problem with my words being inclusive, you deserve to be excluded. Next we have channel favourite Critfax, who made a video on defining woman. Here Critfax made the great point that you can't define anything really, including the word chair, and considering that we can't define chair, I guess it only makes sense to conclude that anybody can identify as a chair. So I'd like to congratulate all the trans chairs of the world and give a huge thank you to Critfax for standing up for the trans chair community. Soon it will be the LGBTQIA2C+ movement, and then we'll have an inclusive movement. Demon Mama made a video addressing the trans-racial analogy, and made a really good point about how with certain categories it makes sense to have stricter definitions, and therefore you can't compare gender to race. It simply makes sense for one of these categories to have a far less strict definition than the other. Demon Mama then went on to explain how it doesn't make sense for race to have a strict definition, and that's why we can't compare race to gender, which should have a strict definition. Fortunately, I now recognise that this seeming 180 in argumentation was actually demonstrating that not only can we transition identities, but we can even transition the entire points of our arguments halfway through videos. Good job, Demon Mama. Next we have a video by a smaller channel called Bothered Boy, who was primarily confused by why radical feminists were against the idea of just accepting people's individual choices uncritically, which is a good point. Obviously, radical progressivism is more about systemic critique as opposed to the liberal strategy of solely focusing on individual action, but obviously we all know that gender-critical feminists aren't really radical, so this does present a bit of a bothersome contradiction. After this, I responded to Russell Davies, explaining how the LGB Alliance is illegitimate because they want to remove letters from LGBTQIA2C+. However, this would only make sense if the point of activism was to fight for the rights of particular demographics. But why do that when your activism could fight for the rights of all demographics at once? This is why even at the time you could see this convincing me when I realised that we could all just become e-activists. Let's have activism for everybody. Activism for same-sex attracted people, activism for Ukrainians, activism for Palestinians, activism for NIMBYs who object to the new wind farm being built near them. Everybody deserves activism, so why would we want to use language that implies activism can ever be exclusively for a specific group or cause? Marxist Pool made a video about gender-critical views and materialism, explaining how material analysis is totally consistent with trans identity, and he made the point by spending over half the video stressing how same-sex attracted people have existed throughout history. Now, you might think that this isn't the same thing as showing how trans identity existed throughout history, but of course, as Russell Davies taught us, we can just group any number of different demographics together whenever we feel like it. So proving that same-sex attracted people have always existed in material reality also proves that trans-identified people have always existed. And of course, how could we forget the ancient Egyptian NIMBYs and their courageous fight against wind turbines on the Giza Plateau? Now, some people have asked me to respond to Kaylin Conrad's video on how gender criticism is a cult, and to be fair, Conrad has impressed me in the past. When I saw a video on the TERF alt-right connection, I thought it was going to be a load of superficial associations that don't really speak to any meaningful connection between the two groups. However, when I saw the video, I discovered such damning evidence as that Meghan Murphy once said that right-wingers aren't wrong about everything, Posey Parker had been on one far-right person's show, and J.K. Rowling has a pen name that's the same as the guy who invented gay conversion therapy. Truly, this substantial association of interest goes right to the top. And continuing with this theme, Paul the Robin showed how Graham Linehan wasn't really a progressive who had changed his mind on gender identity due to his progressive beliefs, because in fact, Linehan had been critical of some women, showing that all of his fierce campaigning for women's reproductive rights in Ireland was just an elaborate hoax. We all thought that Father Ted and the IT crowd were funny, but nothing could have prepared us for Linehan's ongoing comedic project, a performance art piece where he pretends to be motivated by progressive concerns, but secretly reveals that he's an anti-feminist misogynist all along by criticizing some women. And the anti-gender critical movement is particularly poised to make this objection, since they never criticize women. Jessie Gender produced a video demonstrating the gender-critical to far-right pipeline, showing how one person can go from being a regular liberal progressive type to being a far-right extremist. Now, admittedly, the person that Jessie Gender chose to make the focus of this case study was a rather unique individual, in that they were simultaneously J.K. Rowling, a neoliberal social progressive who had expressed some mild criticisms of trans identity, and Lily Cade, an obscure pornographer who advocates mass murder. These two personalities coexist, but aren't actually associated with each other in any substantial way. However, I think it's pretty clear that the only explanation for how these two personalities could both exist in the same universe is that the gender-critical movement must be functioning as a pipeline, turning moderates into radicals. Otherwise, how could J.K. Rowling and Lily Cade both exist? Next, we have ContraPoints' video on autogynephilia, where ContraPoints claims not to be an autogynephile. Next, CritFacts had a turn at showing how the gender-critical movement is secretly right-wing, and while a lot of good evidence was provided, the single best piece of evidence had to be when CritFacts showed that both the right-wing and gender-critical people think furries are kind of cringy.
All the single furries, all the single furries, all the single furries, all the single furries.
If there's one thing that this channel can no longer support, it's people who think furries are cringy.
I'm just a pup, don't know how to stop shaking my own little tail.
Sorry, gender-critical people, but you need to go join the far right, the only movement that thinks furries are cringy.
If you liked it, then you should have put a leash on it. I got sheen on my fur, and I want a myrrh.
Now, I did actually treat the first part of Kaylin Conrad's video on TERFs and the alt-right as a separate video, and this is because I wanted to give special attention to Conrad's brave undercover operation where Conrad found out the secret gender-critical plan was to pants everybody. Absolutely disgusting. How could anybody associate with such a movement? Now we get to one of my favourite videos, PhilosophyTube's transphobia video. What I've grown to love about this video is how Abigail totally destroys the gender-critical movement by showing how their only argument is hyperskepticism. Hyperskepticism is explained to be when you just argue that because somebody can't be 100% certain that they're right, they therefore shouldn't hold to the beliefs that they do. This literally is the only argument gender-critical feminists make, and Thorne is absolutely right to dismiss it. I also like the end where PhilosophyTube points out that because gender-critical feminists can't be 100% certain that they're right, they therefore shouldn't hold to the beliefs that they do. In Lily Alexandre's video about how TERFs are wrong about biological sex, one of Alexandre's chief sources points out that by relating women to biological sex, we're returning back to an oppressive conception of womanhood. Now, I must admit that before I thought that an oppressive idea of womanhood would actually argue that woman means something beyond biological reality. Rather than just being a value-neutral observation of the existence of the female sex, misogyny would instead argue that there is some moralistic essence to being a woman. However, fortunately, I remembered that Lily Simpson had already explained that just recognizing biological females exist in itself is enough to justify reasoning that they should all go back in the kitchen. It's good to see Lilies sticking together and having each other's backs. Then we had a Samantha Lux video responding to Matt Walsh where Lux totally contradicted me. I'd always argued that gender identity theory couldn't give a clear definition of woman, but Lux gave a great definition: somebody who speaks with a rising intonation. Now I know exactly how to speak if I ever want to go into a woman's toilet. Now in ContraPoints' video titled Tiffany Tumbles, there really weren't many arguments and it just ended with Contra having a mental breakdown. This really changed my mind about TRAs because prior to watching this video I used to think the content they produced was dishonest. In Sentient Darkness's response video to me, Sentient makes the point that I misquoted YouTuber Arby. See, Arby said that sex is not a binary as long as there is a hypothetical third conceivable sex. Whereas I quoted him as saying that sex is not a binary as long as there is a hypothetical third conceivable sex, and Sentient Darkness pointed out that what he actually said was that sex is not a binary as long as there is a hypothetical third conceivable sex. So I'm happy to have been corrected on that point. Rowan Ellis did a good job explaining what gender-critical feminism is, and did an especially good job countering the narrative that TRAs are lesbophobic by explaining that she had become ashamed of using the label lesbian because she didn't agree with gender criticism. Clearly, it's therefore the gender-critical side's fault that a lesbian is ashamed of using the label that accurately describes her. Now, after Samantha Lux criticised Matt Walsh, another Sam, in the form of Sam Collins, jumped in. Now, obviously, Matt Walsh's video was critical of trans identity and aimed at kids, and Collins asks us to imagine a crazy scenario. What if there were content directed at kids that was pushing trans identity? I'd never considered the possibility of this far-out hypothetical before, but it made me realise Matt Walsh is very wrong to push his ideas on kids. That's why I'm now in favour of the pro-trans movement. Sheep in the Box made a video debunking all the various transphobic arguments people give. Of these, my favourite would have to be where Sheep argues that if we say that trans women aren't women, then we could also say black women aren't women. They're just different kinds of womanhood, and neither is more valid than the other. Now, I consider myself an ally of black women, so I think I'm definitely aligning myself with them when I proudly declare that their claim to being a woman is no more valid than a biological male's. Truly, this is the more anti-racist sentiment. Next, Sam Seder's Majority Report was back with Emma Vigeland taking the reins and interviewing an expert on gender who made the incredibly powerful point: there is no universal woman experience, because some women get breast cancer and some women don't. Thank you, Kyla Schuller, for liberating me of my belief in the feminist Borg singularity by explaining that actually, women do have different experiences. Take that, yes, all women. I bet you feel ridiculous for saying that yes, all women get breast cancer. And finally, the most recent video I've responded to is ContraPoints' pronouns video. What I really liked about this was when ContraPoint said that it's bad for people to simply agree with trans identity because it's polite or nice. Rather, people should agree with trans identity because they are convinced by the strength of the arguments. And I like to think that this video has shown that strength in its full force. So that's the end of the video, and I know what you're thinking. Why haven't I mentioned the ContraPoints TERFs video? And the simple answer is because I only made 9 response videos to it. It's just not that significant a part of my channel's history. Anyway, I recognise some of you might be a little bit disappointed to hear that I've now realised that I was completely wrong about everything I was saying, and that the TRAs do in fact have really good arguments and that trans identity is perfectly valid. However, what I'm also realising is that having presented all these great arguments, you can, I hope, understand why it is that I've changed my mind on this issue. So I will say that, even though we disagree, I would appreciate it if you still stuck around. Maybe you subscribed, maybe you liked, maybe you commented below to let me know what you think. You can indeed kind of comment to let me know what you think some arguments I might have missed are. I did actually do a bit of crowdsourcing here. I said, hey guys, what do you think are some of the best, greatest arguments that have been presented against me? And lots of people responded with some really, really fantastic suggestions. So I'm very appreciative of that. Thank you for everybody for watching. And of course, if you do want to give on Patreon, I'm probably going to get a lot of people cancelling their Patreon subscriptions because because they can't handle the fact that I'm speaking truth. Of course, the gender critical position is incredibly popular, never censored or shut down at all. So I was doing fine when I was advocating for that position, but now I'm going to be advocating for the much more controversial and countercultural idea that trans identities are hecking valid. And that's going to be a really tough journey, but I'm just going to have to fight it out. So please just like drain your own gender essences maybe to halfway, because I really need that extra kind of like my gender essence is feeling drained right now because of all this stuff. So I just like I need to get that man essence up to I think even like I possibly need to go kind of double barrel gender fluidity, triple even with the non-binary stuff, just like get all my gender essences just up to the max so I can kind of just use it like fuel, which is I think that's how it all works now. Anyway, yeah, all right, so that's everything that I said. Bye. Oh wait, I guess I should just say thank you to my current patrons. In addition to the names scrolling past on your screen right now, I would like to give a special thanks to last month's patrons: Anthony, Diana, June, Space Jack, and Rachel. You're all very appreciated. Next up, we have Walsh's video on the sex spectrum. Now, Walsh actually makes two really good points in this video. First of all, showing that sex is a spectrum by taking a variety of different expressions of biological sex and putting them on a spectrum. I mean, that's pretty irrefutable. What else could